Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Medieval Reader. So today I am doing my first recent reads of 2018. I have 4 books to talk about today, and these are books that I've read on the side that I wasn't assigned. Well, maybe one I was somewhat assigned, at least indirectly. And these are all books that stood out to me that I haven't talked about yet on my channel. So let's begin. The first book is A Morbid Taste for Bones, the first in the Chronicles of Brother Cadfael mystery series by Ellis Peters. Ellis Peters is actually a woman. Her real name was Edith Pargeter, but she wrote the Brother Cadfael mysteries under the name Ellis Peters. She also wrote under other pseudonyms when she wrote other kinds of books, I think some historical fiction. I would like to branch out and try some of her other works, but I think that in March I'd like to read another Brother Cadfael mystery. So in A Morbid Taste for Bones, we are introduced to Brother Cadfael, who is actually a former crusader. We don't know a lot about him, not at least in the first book, but we do know that he fought alongside Godfrey de Bouillon, who was the major crusader of the First Crusade. So this story takes place in the 11th century. Brother Cadfael now has retired, and he's living in the Benedictine monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul in Shrewsbury, which is in England. And he is particularly in charge of the gardens. He and 2 other brothers, Brother Columbanus and Brother John, take care of the garden. Brother Columbanus is a mystic, while Brother John doesn't exactly know if he wants to stay in the monastery. He is thinking that maybe he'd like to try the outside world a bit. Prior Robert is interested in finding a relic so that the monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul can finally house a relic. It is the only Benedictine monastery in the entire region that doesn't house a relic. And so to bolster its reputation and to be competitive in the region, Prior Robert decides that he really needs to find a relic. And so with the help of a particular visionary monk, they discover that there are some miracles that have been wrought by the relics of Saint Winifred in this Welsh village where Brother Cadfael goes to serve as a translator, because he's originally Welsh, even though he's living in an English monastery. So he goes along with Brother Columbanus, since he's the mystic, and Brother John. At least he convinces Prior Robert to take Brother John with him, because Brother John, like I said, he wants to leave the monastery. So he tags along, and they go to this Welsh village thinking it's going to be really easy to convince the locals that their saint has been doing all of these miracles in an English monastery. But not all of the Welsh are convinced, particularly not Riziart. Riziart is one of the major clansmen in this village, and he has a daughter named Sioned. Sioned is in love with an outlaw named Engelert. At least he used to be an outlaw. Now he lives in the same household as Riziart, but still Riziart doesn't feel like he should marry his daughter because he has this complicated history, and also I think he was English. So Riziart, on the one hand, is dealing with his daughter and who she should marry. And then he's very protective of his Welsh identity and his village, and he wants his village to maintain its independence from England. So he's very suspicious when these monks come in from an English Benedictine monastery and claim that a Welsh saint has been performing miracles in their monastery. He doesn't believe it. He thinks that it's all fake. And Riziart says, no, absolutely not. I'm convinced that you guys are all frauds. Why should we give our saint's relics to you? But then Riziart is found dead with an arrow in his chest. And now Brother Cadfael decides he's gonna try to figure out who did it and why. What I really like about Ellis Peters, at least this first Cadfael mystery, is that the mystery is only one plot line in the entire book. There are a number of other plot lines along the way. The question of miracles, the conflict between the English and the Welsh in the 11th century. There's a lot of historical material that is just very elegantly woven into this mystery, so that even if you're not particularly into reading mysteries, you would really enjoy this book. Now, I like reading mysteries. I love Agatha Christie, for example. But I think that Brother Catfile is just a more interesting character than Hercule Poirot. Not that I'm going to criticize Hercule Poirot. I do think that he is a fantastic detective. I love my Belgian detective. But Brother Catfile is a very complicated character. And actually all of the characters in this book have a backstory. We start to learn a little bit more about them. And a lot of time is spent trying to understand the conflict between the Welsh and the English, and the family drama in the Riziert household, so that even if you're not looking to just read a mystery, if you are a budding medievalist, or if you just really like historical fiction, you will really love the Brother Catfile mysteries. I would like to thank Anna, whose channel I will link below, for recommending this book to me on Goodreads. I added it on Goodreads and she definitely told me that it was worth picking up, and now I look forward to continuing with the series. The second book is The Treatise on Tolerance by Voltaire. So Voltaire, as you may know, was an 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, and he was very concerned about religious tolerance because 18th century France was not very tolerant. And his treatise on tolerance was inspired by the Calas affair. So Jean Calas was a French Protestant, an Huguenot, who, along with the rest of his family, was accused of having murdered his son Marc-Antoine for wanting to convert to Catholicism. And even though there are still some unanswered questions about this case, what is clear is that the justice system was completely broken in this case. So Jean Calas was tortured and killed on March 10th, 1762 for murdering his son Marc-Antoine. Marc-Antoine was found hanging in the front room, and there are some details that are a little bit suspicious. First of all, his eldest son Louis had already converted to Catholicism, and he also had a servant who was also Catholic. Now, some will argue that that was French law, that Protestants had to hire a Catholic servant. Still, it seems odd that even though the entire family was accused of murdering the son, only the father was condemned. And worse, there was never an actual trial. Basically, a bunch of zealous Catholics came, took down the body, raised the body up, and venerated it as a holy martyr, a martyr for the Catholic faith, where Marc-Antoine's body, I mean, he's already dead, is made to sign a document saying that he has renounced the Protestant faith, that he has embraced the true church. And so basically, a bunch of Catholic fanatics convince the court that Jean Calas and his wife and one of his sons, one of the sons who obviously wasn't killed, and the servant were all involved in killing the son, Marc-Antoine. And so Voltaire was really concerned about the injustice of this trial. Through Pierre, who actually went to Geneva to speak to Voltaire about what was going on, and Voltaire wrote the Treatise on Tolerance, inspired by this affair. And so while the affair is mentioned in part in this treatise, the treatise is much more than that. Voltaire looks at religious tolerance in different cultures. He looks at it in the Roman Empire and argues, rightly actually, that for the most part, the Roman Empire was tolerant even towards Christians. There are some exceptions. What I thought was really, really interesting is that Voltaire was actually quite informed by contemporary biblical scholarship. So for example, he will bring into question the authorship of certain gospels. He will talk about how in the Old Testament, salvation is not actually a concern. Really, it's all about punishment and reward in this world. His argument is that essentially that killing people who disagree with you is not Christian. It does not follow the Gospels. You would think this is something that people would just know, right? That, of course, the Gospels do not call people to kill other people in the name of God. But actually, this wasn't the case. In 1572, 10,000 to 70,000 Huguenot French Protestants were murdered on St. Bartholomew's Day. And in Voltaire's day, 200 years later, Catholics in southern France still celebrated the massacre as a holy event. So I think that this is an important work because Voltaire really tries to unpack the arguments that people make in defense of religious persecution. Of course, they don't put it that way. And I think it's incredibly important work today in an age of increasing religious intolerance. The third book was The Sellout by Paul Beatty. So February is Black History Month in the United States, and in my quest to read more of the books that I already own, I thought I should finally get to The Sellout. The Sellout is being sold as a satire, but actually Beatty doesn't really think that he wrote a satire. The Sellout won the Man Booker in 2016, and it's about a character who calls himself Me. He's our narrator, and he is African American, having grown up in Dickens, which is a ghetto in Los Angeles, California. And suddenly Dickens has been removed from the map because California is just very embarrassed that Dickens is on the map. It is, by removing it from the map, they can just pretend that it doesn't exist, that there aren't problems to be dealt with. And suddenly our narrator decides that it would be a good idea to resegregate the school, the local high school. And he also has a slave named Hominy Jenkins. So Hominy Jenkins was the last of the Little Rascals. The Little Rascals seem to be Black men and women, or maybe children actually, who would play stereotypical Black characters in very, very racist films in the early 20th century. So Hominy Jenkins played one of those characters, and so he became quote-unquote famous by being ridiculed. And so he has all of this internalized oppression, and so he wants to be whipped, and he wants to be treated as a slave. And so Me, our narrator, does. And he's had an interesting childhood as well. So our narrator had a father who was a failed intellectual. He was a psychologist, but then he just never really made it. And then on top of that, he was killed in a police shootout. And so the son, and he used to homeschool his son, and the son was basically emotionally abused by the father. And so the narrator has quite a lot of problems himself, but he's also very aware of what has happened to his hometown because of the so-called color blindness of the United States post-civil rights movement. And it is funny. It's not laugh out loud funny, and I don't necessarily think it was a satire. I think what Paul Beatty does is explore the limitations and the problems of contemporary America with respect to race issues. One of the more interesting scenes is where the narrator starts to think about how he can segregate an already Black and, well, partially Latino school. So the school is already basically segregated, which really gets you thinking about how much has or has not changed since the 60s. Our narrator at the beginning of the book is before the Supreme Court of the United States in a case called Me versus the United States of America. And the Black justice is not exactly very happy, as you can imagine, by what the narrator has done. And so the rest of the book is basically him recounting what has happened. It was just a really interesting book, quite a page-turner, and it really did remind me of swift a little bit in its exploration of oppression. And the most recent book that I read was Momo by Michael Ende. So Michael Ende is a German author, or was a German author, most famous for his book, The Never-Ending Story. Now, if you are anything like me, you watched The Never-Ending Story as a child, and you love the movie. But the movie only covers the first half of the book. I made a review of the book a few years ago on my blog, and I will link that down below. Momo was written before The Never-Ending Story, and it is the other book that has been translated into English. I know that Ende wrote many books in German, but only 2 have been translated into English, which is too bad. Because I really, really liked Momo. This edition was translated by J. Maxwell Brownjohn. Momo is a girl who grew up in an orphanage that was a very unpleasant environment, and so she ran away and now lives in the ruins of an old amphitheater. She has 2 friends who call themselves Guido Guide and Beppo Road Sweeper. Guido Guide is a storyteller, someone who basically tells tall tales. He makes up stories about the history of the town. And Beppo Road Sweeper is an older man, also Momo's friend, who sweeps the road. And Momo is just a great listener, and we begin by talking about all the great qualities that Momo has. Yes, it is a didactic book. Yes, it is partially allegorical. But I still enjoyed reading the story because this book also deals with some philosophical questions, this time about time itself. So the town is suddenly assaulted by a bunch of men in gray suits. And I'm not going to tell you what it is that these men do, but it does deal with the question of time. And Momo has to try to solve the problem and save the town. And it was fun. It's quite quirky. There's a lot of whimsy. If you like the fairy tale, the Fairyland series, I believe it's called, by Catherine M. Valente, you will probably like the book Momo. I honestly preferred it to The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, because I found Momo to be a more compelling character than September. The message is pretty straightforward, but it was still quite a page-turner. And my edition has some nice illustrations like this, and some smaller illustrations like this. It was actually it was a nice book, and I definitely do recommend it. So let me know if you've read any of these books, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.